Reminder, this is the second webinar in a 3-part series. The series is called Food and Knowledge Systems of Indigenous Peoples to Advance Healthy and Sustainable Diets. And this webinar is going to be about how to bring Indigenous perspectives in research on Indigenous peoples' food systems. So I'll just begin by introducing myself. I'm Gina Kennedy, and I'm a principal scientist with the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT. And I'm also the Director for Research, Translation, and Impact for the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. And then finally, I'm the chair of the IUNS Task Force on Traditional and Indigenous Food Systems and Nutrition. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome everybody to this second webinar of our series. The first webinar is available as a YouTube. I don't know if that's on the second slide. If not, I'll find the YouTube link and I'll put it in the chat for everybody. Yes, thank you. And that was held on May 2nd. And hopefully, if you can take a photo of the YouTube link, we can circulate the slides also, hopefully, to the participants list after. I just want to say that we're going to be recording this, so we can also put the second webinar also up on YouTube. So just be aware that this is being recorded. And I'd like to start also by thanking the Agriculture to Nutrition Community of Practice, the platform that we're using today for this webinar. They have, I think, been a community of practice for probably over 2 decades to bring together the fields of agriculture and nutrition. So it's a really robust community of practice, and we really appreciate them letting us use the platform and advertise this webinar series also through their platform. So the first of our 3-part series was on methods, and we had a lot of nice speakers talk about methods used to conduct participatory research with Indigenous communities on their food systems. And again, that can be found on the YouTube link. And then today's series is going to discuss perspectives. And so we'll hear about diverse approaches and perspectives to accompany research methods and build the scientific evidence base. And the third series is going to be on policy mechanisms that relate to aspects of health, agriculture, and the environment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think we'll just get started. Our first speaker is Michael Kotutwa Johnson. So happy, Michael, that you're able to join us today. Thank you so much. And Michael is an assistant professor with the University of Arizona School of Natural Resources and the Environment, Cooperative Extension, and the Indigenous Resilience Center. Michael's research focuses on Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and land use management schemes related to food, energy, conservation, and water. Michael's a member of the Hopi tribe, and he has several publications on traditional ecological knowledge, as well as recently he's been a co-author on the Indigenous Peoples chapter in the National Climate Assessment 5. But most importantly, Michael is very passionate about his Hopi farming practices, especially his Hopi corn and beans and dryland farming. And he continues to give many talks on the subject and research on the Hopi ways of agriculture. So Michael, the floor is yours.
You're muted, Michael.
Okay, I got it. Am I unmuted now? Am I still muted?
Good. You're good.
Okay. Am I on? Is my screen showing?
Yes. Looks
Okay.
perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks you for the introduction, Gina. Thank you for the invite, Trina, and my fellow panelist, Valarie there. I've been farming since I've been around age 10. We have a history of farming in the Southwest without irrigation for the last 3,000 years at least. That's the minimal, I think. And so, I think, it already really plays importance of place in indigenous ways of knowing, as my title presents. Over history, you really become really familiar with the environment. You get to know what grows well in which space, and what sands or soils produce good crops and things like that. But more important, you really develop a relationship. Everything out here where there's high rates of species and wildlife diversity, there's also high rates of language richness. And so where I'm from is no different than that. 3,000 years you speak Hopi, and people can understand it. We still have our own dialects and from place to place, mesa to mesa. And I'll just start with that. But so this is the important place, is what I'm going to talk about, bringing some outside stuff, inside stuff, and where do we really this research that's always been done about us? Where do we fit in, and where do we go from there? So, first of all, this is always a stunning fact, and I kind of start some of my presentations with this, but, right now, indigenous people, are responsible for 80% of global biodiversity on just 25% of the planet's land, that exists on 25% of land, with less than only 5% of the population. So if you really think about that's pretty incredible. We're basically the true stewards of the globe, and 80% of biodiversity we're responsible for now. So my big question is, what happened to the rest of it? Where did it go? Did it just disappear? What happened to it? And there's a number of reasons, and I can kind of make a claim to that. What happened to it? It's just people forgot, the important things of life, the things that allowed us to continue. And therefore, along with that, with industrialization came a loss of biodiversity, as we started going from, a tremendous amount of crops that people used to eat all the time, maybe 6 or 7 that is being pushed on the globe. All in the way of trying to help people from starving. And so, this what's rare fact that 70% of the world still feeds themselves on acres that are only 1 to 5 acres in length, and not the big 2,000 ones that the corporations still keep to push. And so that's just an interesting fact. But and why is that important? Because right now, over 50% of global gross domestic product, GDP, relies upon nature and its biodiversity. So 50% of the things that we produce right now rely upon that 80% of biodiversity that we have. Now, where does that take us? Well, first of all, we really have to understand, when we're looking at indigenous people and we're trying to understand where they come from, we're often portrayed as victims. And so when you look at the set and you're dealing with indigenous people, and we're basing everything on gross domestic product and not the handshake, what we're considered first or third world countries, low income countries, developing nations, and even things like the global north and south. Just because we don't have a big GDP doesn't mean that we are not resilient, and that our food systems still should be respected. And so, I'm just making that claim because I think, unless we shift out of this mindset, we're always going to continue to rather than elevate indigenous people on top, we just kind of look at them as victims. And when we go to do research, we really don't know how to communicate them. It's the colonialism had a big effect in the globe, and so we're just a part of that. But there's more than that. So, what is the results of place for 3,000 years? Okay, for 3,000 years, we've been living in this location. First of all, it's the crop bioversity of our seeds. All of our seeds is not a monocrop. Even our corn, it's not like they don't all grow the same height. They don't all, produce the same amount of ears, and much less the same amount of color, things like that. So they're very diverse, and that goes with our squash and our melons and everything else like that. They're very diverse. And so because of that, they're able to adapt to a climate. You can see one of the pictures there. You can see the cracked air in a drought area, but look how great that plant is. We only plant in areas where we only get 6 to 10 inches a year, 6 to 10 inches a year. Now that's significant, because when I was at Cornell University, they said 3 inches of rainfall a year to produce things like corn. But all of our plants have adapted to this system, and we have a unique system in order to raise these plants without irrigation. And so we've tailored this pretty good. So it's one of the few places that I know that, we raise things to fit the environment and don't manipulate the environment to fit the things. And so it's kind of like that. So these environmental friendly management schemes are very important. And also this general knowledge that like with stories and language is very important to reinforce these ideas, reinforce these traditions. And so to make it fun, like the kids in the picture, to make them enjoy what they're doing and stuff like that, to encourage them to do these things. And that's just the importance of generational knowledge being passed down from generation to generation. In my case, I'm a 253rd generation farmer. I think it switches from 250 to 253 once in a while, but I'm still pretty up there. So, you know, these indigenous values focus on the relationship. And I think that's one thing that we don't understand. You know, there's movements like regenerative agriculture, but we're still too much focused on the practices and the techniques, even so forth with looking at indigenous food systems. But what's really important and what's really needs to be studied is the relationship we have with nature. And I like to use a lot of pictures. So this relationship that I'm talking about is for example, this is just an example. There's my house on the left or your right, made out of stone. And then there's a bird's nest on the other side right there, and he was building his house, his home out of stone too, right under the awning up there. So I have to sit back and think about these things. Now, who's teaching who? You know, it's that relationship. We're really learning from each other when you really think about it, but it's kind of neat. And so if you can look at things like that, you know, it's always do this, but this should also be looked into the research and the methodologies that people use too, because I think sometimes we forget to look at some of the cultural significance of indigenous people and what they're doing and what kind of research is proper and what is not and things like that. And so, but we also have to look at the communities more so than I would say the tribal governments, because it's the communities that have been doing a long time. The tribal governments are just something that was invented around 1934. And so, and they do deserve the respect as far as self-determination and things like that. But we really need to look about how we're going to do these research, who to talk to in the community and things like that. It may take a little longer, but you know, to me, it's well worth the effort. So what does this place-based agriculture, to me, it really brings a lot of continuity, you know, this place-based agriculture. So I'd like to show these pictures because in 1915, you'll see two pictures that are black and white, and you'll see the same system in 2015, over 100 years later. And so this system's still working, right? And so the only methodology that I have to really use, and I'll explain that on my next slide down or two, is what kind of methodology and how do we look at things? You know, as scientists, I'm a scientist myself, but how do I look at things? You know, what's the result that I'm trying to get here? Does it necessarily have to be, you know, so quantified that people need the data to understand it? In some cases it does, but things like this, it doesn't. You know, I had the NRCS come in one time and they wanted me to use cover crops on a field like this. And I said, there's no way, because you'll take all the soil moisture out of our soils and it just won't work out well. And I couldn't convince my farmers to do otherwise. So, you know, if the system's 3,000 years old, it works pretty good, then they should keep it like that. And so what are the benefits of these practices? So first of all, we always talk about the benefits of things, but we always talk about the benefits in numbers. Rarely do we talk about the benefits of human well-being. And so these ones are pretty much human well-being in a nutshell. You know, it helps reduce obesity because a lot of us have that trouble up here on the reservations. Reinforces family culture. It stabilizes families. It's environmentally friendly, and it increases the real concept of sharing. I think that's the most important thing. So what happens if we don't do this? So what happens? So what are some of the things, and why do I do these things? And what happens when we forget these things? When we forget what we're learning? You know, you have all these crazy rates of, you know, diseases of the heart, diabetes, strokes, you know, all these things, even suicide, accidents. Accidents is one of the big time things. But you know that these numbers shouldn't happen. We're living in our own country, and so we need to find research and methodology that helps our communities. You know, helps our community. So I'm a real big person on this participatory research stuff. And so this holistic research approach is through indigenous ways of knowing. What really is that? How do we do that? Well, first of all, you know, when we look at holistically, you know, you'll have the scientific method on the left-hand side, which we all learned basically in the 6th grade or so, or 5th grade, you know, and on the Hopi method, I have the same thing, but I've just quantified it differently. So ask a question, you know, observe environmental conditions, I call it, you know, do background research, communicate with elders, you know, communicate your results, the last one. So how do you communicate your results, you share your harvest with your family and you talk about it, right? And so in some ways, this is just like the scientific method, and some people may be laughing about that, but in ways, it's really brings involvement. It really brings the community, because you're asking the community exactly what their input is. You're not just going out there with a pencil or putting out a survey, but you're actually talking with the community to get this method, this Hopi method, scientific method. So they're very similar, right? And so it just depends upon how you look at things. And so a lot of our stuff is what I would call in the proof of concept. You know, we've been here 3,000 years, and what more proof can you do? Raising the same things for 3,000 years is kind of remarkable. And so, you know, outside community keys to Indigenous agriculture and U.S. and well-being, well, first of all, you know, having these partnerships with Western sources, what kind of partnerships can we do to improve their methodology? First of all, you know, we need to have direct funding to USDA, by USDA to native-led food organizations that are community supported. I think that's important. Land-grant universities, of course, must partner with tribal community colleges as a teaching tool. You know, they can be a teaching tool and also help with a lot of research because they have the capital. Natural resource data collection for Indian country is only there because, you know, we need to have validation for doubters that we even here in the United States, you know, in the United States, we make up, I think it's 5.4% of key biodiversity areas, despite that we only live on 2% of the land in the United States. So 2% of land makes up 5.4 of key biodiversity areas in the United States. Isn't that incredible? And so the Tribal Agricultural Code, I think is very important. I'm trying to get tribes to do that. That has a number of things. It also has to do with research too, because it protects us from this mechanism and what I call the original harm. The original harm is a word that I learned from a colleague of mine and my partner about, you know, what things used to be in the past and how we're able to capitalize on that. And so, but when I look at the research, you know, you have to ask us, what do you want your results, you know? And so when you're doing methodologies, you know, you have to look at what is your evaluation you want to lead to, you know? And so I had asked this is from Zuni Youth Enrichment Project. And I said, well, how do you evaluate things? Are you looking for numbers? Are you looking for, what kind of data are you using? You know, everything that people often use. And this is what their evaluation tool is what does your community value? How can we measure what our community values are? You know, key indicators of wellness, connection to community, connection to Zuni culture, sense of belonging, level of enjoyment, confidence in practicing healthy traditions. You know, those aren't, you know, on your top 5, you know, scientific, you know, data things, but, you know, they're very important for the community because when you research, at least my research, I like to make sure that the community is involved in these type of things. And so one of my projects that I kind of like to focus on is this revitalization of the American Indian food systems. You know, it's something that I've been working on with the Rockefeller grant. And first of all, it's going to be growing out traditional foods, something I do already. It's going to be nutritional analysis on indigenous crops. That we have to have the tribe's permission on that. We're asking the tribe to have their input on that. Survey of institutions. Now, this is important because I'm looking at seeds and plant parts and what is the process and what is the accessibility for tribal communities to rematriate those back. You know, and then the tribal agricultural line that I'm putting together involves all Pueblo tribes in Arizona, 19 in New Mexico, and 1 in Texas. See what they would like to do if they want to keep raising things traditionally and get them more involved. Because as Pueblo farmers, we've been doing that for a long, long time, places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. And also this agricultural data is also very important. So I'm developing a methodology as part of this Rockefeller grant too, so that people use to talk with indigenous people. Now, it's not going to be a one size fits all. That's always been the problem in Indian country. One place doesn't, one method doesn't work in another method, but at least gives you a base on how you can tweak it to make it work to where you think it would go. And so, you know, that's pretty much about it. You know, this is one of my favorite pictures. This was a bunch of Head Start kids coming out to visit me, and corn in our society is very important. It's so important that we call it our mother. And so I wanted to give these kids a little something there. And so they can see, you know, that's all. That's my evaluation right there. I had a smile on a child's face. And I think that's the most important thing. So thank you very much.
Wow, amazing, Michael. Thank you so much for that presentation and for the really great points that you made about terms that limit mindsets and the victimization culture, which is not at all a helpful mindset. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to. I always say the same thing when it comes to traditional foods, that nobody wants to be considered a neglected or an underutilized or an orphan food. So we need to really change our vocabulary when we talk about foods as future foods, forever foods, or food treasures. So I really did appreciate that point that you made. And also your point that's so impressive and incredible that you have 3,000 years of place-based and generational knowledge on how to grow things that are well adapted to your conditions. I have asked people to put any questions they might have for you into the Q&A, and
Yeah.
I apologize that I didn't indicate that earlier. So if you do have a question, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Michael, or you can type it into the Q&A. The Q&A box is at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. It's to the right of chat and 2 spaces before the leave the meeting icon. It just says Q&A. Does anybody have a question for Michael? While people are thinking of their question, Michael, I want to be a little bit provocative with you. So you mentioned terms that limit mindsets. What are your favorite terms that are more correct and appropriate to use?
You know, I really haven't thought about that much, Gina. I think it's just, I mean, I would like to, and I talked about this, and I think you were there when I was talking about the Bellagio. You know, why not call high biodiversity territories, versus low biodiversity territories, or things like that. That's just kind of names of territory with all those people inside of it, I think. But it elevates, put people right at the top. And so like for the example, the United States would be a low biodiversity territory, and but parts in the United States, like on reservations, would be high biodiversity territories. And so one of my biggest problems that I'm having right now is that the first natural nature assessments being put out there is starting to be work on that, but there's no, that I understand, any Indigenous involvement in that, and so it's going to be without. It's going to have Indigenous voices in it as far as the authors, but I don't think they're going to do a chapter like they did National Climate Assessment 5. To really show the true biodiversity of Indian country, which is kind of sad because, we're trying to show that we manage our lands well to take advantage of these conservation programs, but it seems like sometimes we just run into a wall. And so, but, that's neither here nor there. But so, kind of a long way about that. I like this high biodiversity, low biodiversity territories for right now. And then just being looked at as one from resilient and not as one from victimhood, I think is what I'm trying to shift off. But also, I think, for me, it's just trying to bring recognition to Indigenous people that we're still here, and that please take us off the museum wall, because we always seem to be portrayed on the museum wall, especially here in the United States, in black and white pictures and things like that. And here I am coming to you live in color. And so, it's a little different and things like that than what it used to be. But, it's just, we really can't talk equity until we can have recognition. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. There are a couple questions for you in the Q&A if you want to answer by typing in an answer. Otherwise, when we get to hopefully the discussion portion of the webinar, we can open some of these back. But if you feel comfortable to type an answer,
yeah, I can type. I'm really anxious to hear Valarie too.
I know. So you don't feel like you need to multitask. We can come back to the questions when we have a Q&A. So thank you so much, Michael. Our next speaker is Dr. Valarie Bluebird Jernigan. Dr. Jernigan is the director of the Center for Indigenous Health Research and Policy and professor of medicine and rural health at the Center for Health Sciences at Oklahoma State University. She has been the principal investigator for more than a dozen research studies that have been focused on improving Indigenous food systems through policy and environmental interventions. Dr. Jernigan directs the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Health Equity, which is a community academic partnership with Indigenous peoples to restore traditional foods and food practices to promote healthy diets and reduce chronic disease. Dr. Jernigan is the inaugural chair of the National Cancer Institute's Intervention Research to Improve Native Health Initiative, which is a collaboration of the NIH-funded investigators conducting intervention science research. And interestingly enough, she also serves on the 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Advisory Committee, which is just amazing. So what an amazing career of work and research. And I'd also just like to say that she's an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma. So thank you so much for joining us, Valarie. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Michael, for that excellent presentation. I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Great.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
I will talk about bringing Indigenous perspectives to research on Indigenous people's food systems. That's the focus of our panel here. And I want to start by thanking the TIFSAN and IUNS partners. Thank you so much for organizing this. And I will be sharing some of the work from my partners, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, Osage Nation, the Center for Alaska Native Health Research at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Danakanaga Inc., which is a wonderful elders advocacy organization in Fairbanks, South Central Foundation in Anchorage, Alaska, the Chickasaw Nation here in Oklahoma, and the Office of Minority Health, DHHS, is our sponsor for the research that I'll be talking about today. So thank you, Yakoke, to these excellent partners. As Gina mentioned, I am the director of the Center for Indigenous Health Research and Policy at Oklahoma State University Center for Health Sciences. You can check out our website, indigenoushealth.com. We are a center that focuses on research, training, and capacity building with Indigenous partners. And the research that we do is primarily focused in cardiometabolic disease risk reduction. We do that through an Indigenous community lens. We do community-based participatory research or tribal research. It's transdisciplinary and it's community-led. Our partners are Indigenous scholars and elders and knowledge holders. And we currently have more than 15 active food sovereignty initiatives that are applying Indigenous methodologies. We just published in December of 2023 a special focus issue on food sovereignty and health. And you can find that in the journal Health Promotion Practice. I think there's about 12 articles there, and they're all free and open access. So please check that out. And I'll be speaking today about the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Health Equity, which is CIHI as we call it. So the genealogy of CIHI really began with a cross-cultural learning exchange with our partners. A NOHO is what it's called, where we gathered in Waianae, Hawaii in 2018. And at this time, we were gathering together. It was a group of folks that I brought from Oklahoma, members of the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Osage Nation. And we came together with our Native Hawaiian partners and Maori partners, really focused on restoring the relationships that our communities have with the land and how to do this to promote better health. And we decided that the best ways to go about this for the particular goals we wanted to accomplish were to focus on food sovereignty. And so that is really the focus of the NOHO in 2018. And from that, the CIHI was born. And the underlying drive to address persistent health inequities is really what prompted us to do this work. The 2020 prevalence of food insecurity in the US was about 10.5% among the US general population. And you can see among American Indian and Alaska Native households, that's 45.7%. So it's a significant disparity. In Oklahoma, that rate of food insecurity is 60%. And we know that American Indian and Alaska Native people are 3 times more likely to have diabetes compared to non-Hispanic whites, and 2.3 times more likely to die from this disease. American Indians and Alaska Natives are 50% more likely to be diagnosed with coronary heart disease when compared to non-Hispanic whites. So these were the conditions that were really driving a lot of this work in the early part of how this started. The aims of the CIAT, we really seek to identify and uplift food sovereignty initiatives that are happening in diverse communities in different contexts and different environments, and really shine a spotlight on those initiatives. We aim to use a decolonized Indigenous approach to measuring outcomes and process evaluation. And we document Indigenous food systems and stories, and hope to strengthen the transmission of generational knowledge. Our efforts center Indigenous wellness and the relationship that we have with food and land, which we consider part of our concept of wellness. And we really want to expand upon the Indigenous models of wellness that we see within the scientific literature, as we're largely excluded in terms of, what's being published. This is a map that shows our partners. We started out with 4 partners, and you can see with the yellow stars, the partners that we started with included Osage Nation and Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and 2 partners in Alaska, South Central and University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we worked together for 2 years, and then we expanded our circle to include partners who had addressed interest and expressed interest in working with us, and were addressing food sovereignty initiatives and needs within their communities. And so those partners are with the green stars, and they include Nome community in Alaska, Washington State University. Jessica Ulrich is a member of the Nome community, and she is working with us there. Yurok tribe, Indian Healthcare of Santa Clara Valley, which is a relocation site in California in the Bay Area, Turtle Mountain Community College, and Dream of Wild Health in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so in addition to our Hawaii partners, we've now expanded the focus of this work to include these new partners who are all doing food sovereignty in these really diverse settings. And the framework for restoring these relationships with land and health is Indigenous food sovereignty, which you probably know well, the definitions, but I've included the definition that we use here: the right and responsibility of Indigenous people to healthy and culturally appropriate foods produced through traditional Indigenous practices. This is a community-led movement that supports Indigenous communities in having greater control over their land and food systems by increasing and protecting traditional and healthy foods and reducing dependence on packaged and fast foods. And it really addresses the need for nutrition and health equity approaches that are embedded within an Indigenous concept of health, wellness, and self-determination. One of the first things that we did was we basically created what we hypothesized to be the relationship between food sovereignty and health in a way that we could depict it and explain it to potential funders and folks who wanted to support this work. This is a model we created with our community partners that is meant to be read left to right. And you can see we compiled a list of food sovereignty activities. So we asked partners, what are these kinds of activities within your respective communities? What do they look like? And the things that people told us were cultural teachings, food knowledge sharing, and stories, subsistence knowledge, ceremony, caring for land, gardening, and farming. Those are all examples of what food sovereignty activities look like. And then we group those according to level of influence. So individual, family and community, and land and place. And then we asked our partners what they hypothesized were the proximal and the distal effects. So what outcomes food sovereignty activities have on communities and individuals, and on the place in which these activities are being implemented. And so this is the model that we created, and a lot of these food sovereignty initiatives are really working with this model and expanding upon it and looking at some of the things that we hypothesized to really test those outcomes to see if their initiatives show those relationships. We propose that connectedness is really what reinforces the food sovereignty activities, and self-determination and cultural continuity are really the mechanisms of action, so to speak, here within this framework. So the structure of the CIAT, it's a 5-year project, and we are just about finished with year 1. The partners all engage in bi-monthly all-partner meetings, and then we have one-on-one meetings with each partner. And we have an Indigenous evaluation team of about 4 people who work with us, and they work with each of the partnering communities to determine methods and measures for how they would like to evaluate their initiatives. In this first year, the partners are identifying and planning a community-driven food sovereignty initiative that improves the relationship to healthy and traditional foods, and increases physical activity and strengthens community connectedness and social support. We're also looking at the collection of a community wellness survey. And I put an asterisk here because one of the things that we've been working on a lot is this decolonizing approach to how we do this research. And one of the important issues that came up is the value of these intertribal data collection processes. Are they useful in getting at improved health, or do they just function to sort of extract data from communities without giving much back? And so one of the things we want to do is really determine the best ways that we can collect intertribal data in a good way, and how might that be done where it's not extractive, but it's relational based, and it strengthens the efforts across the different communities. In year 3, our partners are going to pilot their projects and collect baseline individual data for participants who are engaging in these projects, and then in year 4, implement them and collect follow-up data, and in year 5, dissemination. We are not prescriptive as to what these initiatives look like. It's really up to the community to determine the focus of each project. The partners provide reports to us on a quarterly basis, but they also really talk with our evaluators and really spend a lot of time, just sharing their experience of these initiatives. We are collecting, as I said, quarterly data for our funder, and those are process measures like the number of individuals reached via different trainings, the number of partners engaged, number of meetings held, and we're using a lot of digital story and video data to capture these processes. And then the outcomes data collected, again, vary by site, but some of the examples of outcomes data being collected: traditional foods and foodways, so increases in knowledge and activities in those areas, food security and food sovereignty, increases in food sovereignty activities and changes in food security. And some of the sites are ready and interested in doing some clinical data collection. So they're looking at clinical measures like self-reported and objective health outcomes. We've done, as which mentioned, a lot of trials in the past, so we have the capacity to support communities in including these measures if that's something that they want to do. Well, I'm going to share a couple of examples to wrap up the presentation. The first is Growing Hope, which is the initiative being implemented by the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, which is my tribe. And they are restoring traditional Choctaw gardening practices. So one of the key activities is the distribution and education of traditional heirloom seeds that were carried by our relatives as part of the process in the Trail of Tears. And the women sewed the seeds in the hems of their skirts and brought our seeds to what is now Oklahoma. And so Choctaw Nation is distributing some of these heirloom seeds, teaching us about our history, our stories, our traditional foods, and helping us to learn how to plant traditional Choctaw gardens, which are a big part of our culture, as well as sharing food stories and food preparation and preservation knowledge. So the outcomes that Choctaw Nation are testing: food security, dietary intake, self-reported health, traditional food knowledge, and preparation practices, and Choctaw language. Chickasaw Nation is implementing the traveling garden market, where fresh fruits and vegetables sourced from local farmers will be distributed in 8 low food access communities within Chickasaw Nation. And they're going to pilot this with their WIC program recipients. And they're also partnering with the SNAP Ed program for on-site nutrition education and virtual cooking demonstrations. And they are looking at pre-post changes among adult participants in diet and blood pressure, hemoglobin A1C among folks who have diabetes, food insecurity, and self-rated health. South Central Foundation is implementing these traditional food gatherings. They had a really large one last year. It was highly successful, included 27 workshops hosted by 38 speakers and 3 parallel tracks. And they included video recordings of all the workshops so that they can disseminate this information across the communities. Most of the regions of Alaska were represented in this initiative. They had 130 people in attendance. Most of them were from Anchorage, and in their piloting of this, they conducted pre and post evaluations, and they offered continued medical education credits to participants. So their outcomes showed an increase in knowledge of traditional foods and food practices. And so they're expanding that this year to focus on changes in knowledge and practices. And they're doing a lot more with video to where they can do this work year round and really capture food ways and food practices to be shared and learned by community members across different regions. The Osage Nation is implementing a mobile market. You can see it there in the bottom left-hand corner. And they have this large, extensive farm that they have built. And from that farm, they have produced a great number of fresh fruits and vegetables. And they are now sharing those in more remote regions of the reservation where people aren't really able to get out and travel to Pawhuska, which is where the farm is located. And they're looking at changes in food access intake, food security, and self-rated health. And they're a partner that we've had for quite a long time, done a number of projects with them. So they're expanding to add some clinical measures to assess changes as a result of their mobile market. And finally, the Denakanaga Culture Camps. This is really a camp that is hosted once a year, but it's now expanding to be multiple times a year. It's elders mentoring elders. It teaches traditional foods, knowledge, and practices. And it really emphasizes the relationship to food practices and healing and wellness with residential school survivors and families. And the outcomes are social and emotional well-being, cultural connectedness, self-reported health, and dietary intake. This one's a really wonderful project that gives elders who were survivors of boarding schools an opportunity to learn their traditions, and elders who maybe didn't have the opportunity to teach those traditions, that opportunity is part of this camp. We've learned a lot so far. As I said, we're starting our third year now, and our key learnings to date have been that CIAT is really a strategy that we've learned can access the pre-colonial mind, as Vanessa Watts says. And land-based activities like this are really able to give us that perspective and reconnect with our traditions. We value story as really one of our primary methods for collecting and sharing knowledge. And so everything that we're doing is really based in story, and centering self-determination as a fundamental aspect to the health of Native communities. And hopefully I can come back and share more as we get further along in these efforts. Yakoke, here's a picture of our team, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jernigan. That was really fantastic. I see you're getting a lot of appreciation from the audience. So interesting. Thanks for sharing the project of the CIAT and where you are in that 5-year journey. It was really, really amazing project. I loved how you're focusing on Indigenous models of wellness and really co-creating all the projects with all of your partners and focusing on place and relationships. I actually had a question about disbursement of the food that's being grown, and so I appreciated the Osage Nation food access, like the farmers market, and because I was wondering how the food access portion of it, how that worked. So there are a few questions for you in the question and answer box. I'll just go ahead and read out one of them. That's from Ravathi, excuse me if I mispronounce your surname, Sahajpal. And this question is about during COVID, a lot of us kind of like really got more back into gardening, and we had more time, and we were spending a lot more time place-based, let's say. And then that was some way brought back a lot of our, traditional and Indigenous practices. So the question is, did you find that there was sort of more resilience built up as a result of the pandemic and more reliance on traditional foods? And was this an insight that kind of helped you in moving forward with your CIAT?
COVID hit our populations really hard in Oklahoma. So we had a lot of people pass away, and it was a real time of crisis. And I'm sure it was like that for a lot of other Native populations and communities, but for the Oklahoma populations, it was pretty severe. And so I know that there was a lot of discussion around people starting those practices up during the COVID pandemic, and there was a lot of interest. We had kind of started doing this prior to that. So what we did see, we didn't have the type of community engagement that we had before. That was really hard for us because we do community-based research. So we didn't get a chance to go out and kind of make those connections like we did prior to COVID. But I do think it was also a time where you saw a lot of, empty grocery store shelves. And that really affected the tribes. And one of the things that we found so amazing was it was those small local farms and food meat processing plants that were able to actually keep the foods available in our tribal communities. And so some of those really small places were the only places that were open. And I think it really speaks to the power of local food systems, because when everything fell apart and we saw a real crisis in food access here in Oklahoma, it was the small local and tribally owned Harvest Land Farm, the tribally owned meat packing processing plants that were really the only places people could get their food. And so I think coming out of that, we really saw the power in those and invested a lot in strengthening those local initiatives. And I know the tribes have done a lot of that since COVID at the government leadership level.
Yeah. Wow, great. I'm so sorry, the COVID experience was traumatic for sure. But I'm glad that you are focused, on what you could learn about the power of local and place-based food systems. So thanks for sharing that. There are quite a few other questions. I think in the interest of time, they're in the Q&A. In the interest of time, we'll just hear from our last speaker, and then hopefully we can come back to some of these questions, particularly if as you're looking through them, Valarie, if you'd like to answer one live, then I'll know that you haven't answered it by typing in. So I'm really pleased to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Trina Delormier. She has been a part of our IUNS Task Force on Traditional and Indigenous Food Systems and Nutrition for a long time. So it's great to welcome a good colleague and friend. Dr. Trina is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Food Sovereignty. She's an associate professor in the School of Human Nutrition at McGill University, and she is the associate director for the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and the Environment, or CINE. And her areas of expertise are public health nutrition of Indigenous populations, health inequities, and social determinants of health using participatory research approaches. And so the brainchild for this entire webinar was really Trina's. So I want to really acknowledge her for that. And thank you so much, Trina, for setting this up for us. And we can't wait to hear you speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyawakoa Gina. And thank you to our guest speakers, Michael and Valarie, for taking the time. Many of us who are both doing community research and our academic, doing our job as faculty members in academic units, are in high demand. So I'm very happy that we have these speakers. And I also want to thank the IUNS Task Force on Traditional Indigenous Food Systems and Sustainable Diets for supporting this webinar as well. And also all of the people who took the time to be here today. So in the final presentation, I have the privilege of having had Michael and Valarie explain a lot of ideas that I can hop on and reinforce. But I'm talking, oops, I think my slides are not advanced. I'm seeing they're not I'm not at the beginning. Sorry for the quick jumping there. So I'll start my presentation, which is called Two-Row Research on Ungwehungwe Food Sovereignty and Nutrition Research. So I'm going to explain what two-row is, but I also want to explain the concept of Ungwehungwe, which is what the Mohawk people or the Kanien'kehá:ka people refer to ourselves as the real people or the people, as in many Indigenous languages. So instead of saying Indigenous, sometimes we can use Ungwehungwe, referring to, our connection knowing that we are people who have spirit on this journey on a physical realm. In terms of two-row, research. This is an idea that, it's valuing Indigenous knowledge systems. It is valuing Indigenous ways of doing in research. So we look to these teachings for guidance on how to do research respectfully. And the Turo Wampum is actually one of the oldest treaties between Ngwehunwe on Turtle Island and European settlers. It was with settlers who had come over and wanted to, Dutch settlers who we realized, had a very different way of being in the world. And we recognized that we needed to establish a relationship of living together because of these different ways of being in the world. So essentially what this depicts is that they're two distinct peoples with two distinct ways of being in the world and knowing the world. And we can coexist side by side peacefully with non-interference. And so the two rows symbolize two vessels traveling in the river. So the settlers, ocean-going vessels, and our canoes. And as we travel that river of life, we, can coexist harmoniously, but non-interference in our ways of life. And that was the way to establish and maintain peace. So thinking about this in a research sense, I feel there's a challenge because when we talk about how do we bring together Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific knowledge or other sorts of Western scientific knowledges, there is kind of this intermingling. And we know that we can't reconcile and integrate knowledge systems, but the idea of two-eyed seeing was proposed by elders from Canada, in the eastern part of Canada, to bring together Indigenous ways of knowing and complement them with Western ways of knowing. And as Michael showed us in one of his slides, contrasting the different ways of Western science and Indigenous ways of knowing, this is another way of showing that we can bring together the best of these ways of understanding to current problems in order to understand them better. And Valerie's examples of, using evaluation that's based in values of Indigenous people, these are helpful because it helps us to measure quantitative things or even using qualitative research methods, but also being driven by what is valuable for our communities and what's going to support self-determination and looking at ways to decolonize our approaches. So, when we're talking about bringing Indigenous knowledges together with Western knowledges, I'm drawing on these ways of thinking to help me. And then when I talk about Indigenous ways of knowing as relational, both of my colleagues had mentioned this as well, the idea that an Indigenous ontology is relational. So the nature of the world is seen in relationships. And, Sean Wilson's book, Research is Ceremony, talks about this for those of you who are maybe in these spaces doing research and wanting to use your Indigenous knowledges. And he talks about that, as people, we're not in relationships between people, which is sort of a Western notion that's science as well, sciencey as well, but that we actually are the relationships that we hold. So the nature of who we are and the world around us is relational. And in our ways of doing, we have an opening to important meetings that we call Hondagardi Wadekwa, which means the words that come before all else. And what they are is basically being grateful, asking people to bring our minds together, the people who are gathered, to give thanks to all the people. And we give thanks to the waters and the fish life. And we give thanks to the medicines and the grasses and the gardens, the foods that sustain our lives. And we give thanks to animals, to trees and bushes, to the winds, to the thunders, to the sun, to the stars, and to our grandmother moon. And when we do that, we are saying that we are in these relationships with all of the natural world. And it's important for us to remember that we have responsibilities in those relationships to care for our families, to care for the plants that sustain our lives. Even the word for our traditional food is a relationship. It's not something transactional. It's something that sustains our lives. And that's what I mean in terms of the ways, Indigenous ways of knowing are relational. So that has an implication for how then we want to study a world that's relational, what methodologies that we use. And again, I'm grateful for my co-presenters because they gave us some really good examples of what that can look like. So we also need to think that the nature of Indigenous peoples' food systems as relational. And here I want to just underline that I'm saying Indigenous peoples' food systems, because I saw in a question someone talked about Indigenous food systems. So what I'm talking about are the food systems of Indigenous people. So the relationship between the people, their territory, and the foods that they have been growing there for thousands of millennia. I mean, like for millennia, as Michael pointed out to us. And in our culture, in Mohawk culture, Ganyakahaga culture, we have many foods, but we honor the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And we recognize that food is a gift from creation, came from our creator. We recognize that corn, beans, and squash grow in this mutually supportive relationship. And that tells us something about the way we live our lives too. We need each other to help each other out. That we need the knowledge systems to support the sustainability of these food systems. And how do we know what to do? Well, our ceremonies remind us of that. We have a cycle of ceremonies that's centered on our different foods and the seasons. And it's largely plant foods for our people. And then it's also reminding us of our family and community responsibilities to take care of those food plants because they take care of us. So I'm just going to give you an example from my experience with my community in Kahnawake, from a study that was called Reclaiming Haudenosaunee Food Security. And again, we started this project with looking at food security because, as you've seen in the statistics presented earlier, I don't have the numbers for you, but we can imagine that they are the same inequities that we see. Although this community, Kahnawage's food security status is not as bad as we see in other communities. And I think because we have close of our geographic location, but also just the realities of our community in terms of opportunities, but there is still food insecurity. So the study started to ask, like, how do we reclaim food security? The idea that everyone in the community would have enough food to keep them healthy. And was really, this project was part of a TIFSAN, so the Traditional Indigenous Food System and Nutrition Task Force of the IUNS. We had a project where we were looking at matrilineality, actually, and food systems. And so we put together this team from my community to study the question and to examine how food security experiences in our community, how can we understand those so that we can then explore ways of upholding our responsibilities to take care of our foods, but also to enhance local food security, which is a public health issue. So we're addressing both our responsibilities as Indigenous people, but also addressing a public health or a local community health issue. So this is our team. Everyone is Ungwe. Most of us are from Kahnawake. It was a really wonderful experience. So this article, you can read about the, you can find the publication in Maternal and Child Nutrition, and it's from 2017. So it's getting on in its years now, but I think it's a really good example for the purpose of the presentation, looking at research approaches. So the approach I used for this study, or we use as a team, built on a long-established project that had started in 1994. And it's a partnership between the Kahnawake community and also 3 academic institutions, McGill University, University of Montreal, and Queen's University. Their researchers work with our community, bring students, and work using our code of research ethics. So in this approach, each partner provides ideas and resources that come from their experience, knowledge, expertise, and capabilities. And it's together through respect for each other, consultation and collaboration, the partners significantly strengthen the project and its outcomes. The partners of the project share an understanding that community-based participatory research is a powerful tool for learning about health and wellness, which contributes to the health of the community in which it is being conducted. So you'll probably hear a little bit of what I talked about of the 2-row wampum and people bringing together and contributing they're distinct ideas, but we take it a little bit further in having a relationship of collaboration to co-create an understanding. So in this project, I'm an academic researcher. So even though I'm from the community, I'm still working in an academic space and doing, institutional research with my community, although most of all the researchers were from the community. So just, as I mentioned, I talked about already who the team was. In the study itself, we interviewed 17 people from our community, who we identified as being eligible in food, health, and culture. The data collection and analysis was done collaboratively by the team that you see here. Here we're sitting on the porch of somebody's house and discussing what we were finding. And then we were also building capacity and research with Kalia, who had a baby on her chest at the time, because she was interested. So she became a community researcher. So our research always tries to build capacity both ways. So just a few findings from this research that looked at experiences, hearing people's stories and trying to understand where we can improve food security. So what we found when we talked to people about food security, once they said, well, what is that? Because community people didn't really connect with that idea. But when we explained what it was, they right away talked about collective food insecurity experiences. So for example, in 1990, when we had a crisis here in Kahnawake and also in our sister community of Kanesadake, there were barricades of provincial police, and we were barricaded in our community for 78 days during the summer, and we didn't have access to grocery stores. So the community had to mobilize to ensure everybody had food to eat. We saw similar experiences with the ice storm in 1998. Although, we didn't have a state of emergency in our community, we were able to mobilize to make sure everybody was taken care of. Older people talked about the impact of the Great Depression, it's still part of the memory, the collective memory in Kahnawake. So what we found out is people said that when we have crisis, we care for each other to meet our basic needs. However, everyone reflected that right now, Kahnawake is not food self-sufficient. We cannot feed ourselves to survive in a long-term crisis scenario. And so in order to survive, this would involve a steep learning curve. When we looked at how food security is currently being addressed in Kahnawake, it was mostly through planting and producing food at the household level, through community health and social service programming, programs that coordinate income and social assistance to the community. Through charity, we have a local food bank and anonymous acts of sharing that people talked about, just knowing somebody needs something and leaving food for them, and social sharing. Having family gatherings still plays big in our cultural practices. Some of the challenges that were identified were having the relationship with land. And someone had mentioned that prior to where we're living now in our current location, we were living in villages, but we moved, after the land got exhausted. But we've been living here in Kahnawake for 300 years. So it tells us something if we have this relationship that should have been renewed many times over and hasn't. We also recognize that there's imposition of individual land title through the Indian Act, which is a law in Canada that pretty much has an impact on every aspect of our lives. We have wealthy entrepreneurs that drive up the price of land titles. Just the residential development and housing, demands a lot of land, and things like landfill practices disrupts farmland, forests, and medicinal areas. So those are some of the challenges. And when we asked how can we enhance food security, people talked of planting and innovations could serve cultural education purposes for the community, school, children, youth, and their families, as well as develop tourism. Farming models could provide jobs and diverse training while contributing to healthier, organic, affordable, and traditional foods in the community. That leadership and accountability for food security, and now we're talking more about food sovereignty in the community. So having the community self-determination, driving policies, supporting local action, the recognition that our food is sacred, but also looking at ways to address the policies that make it difficult for us to maintain our food systems and our self-determination. And also looking at revitalizing trade relationships with neighboring and Indigenous communities, because we're part of a global economy and we won't survive as an island, was another way we need to consider. And then finally, people talked about, or we sort of came up with the broader finding that we were experiencing a profound kind of food insecurity, which really is about, needing food sovereignty. It was clear that we had limited cultivation of jonhekwa. That's our foods that sustain us, largely corn, beans, and squash. And it signifies from a Haudenosaunee point of view that, our responsibilities, if we're not going to be able to practice those and uphold them, is really, the root of the profound kind of food insecurity that we're facing. We might not have, we have access to market foods or the food, retail food in crisis. That's a challenge, but we really need to look at our responsibilities. So this is a picture of me with my corn. And I can tell you it's a lot of work, and it's something that you can't do on your own. You need a lot of support from a family at least, or in some way a community approach to doing this. All my corn, the raccoons had the best of it. So moving back now to think about research from the approach that we use. Often you'll hear about the 4 R's or the 5 R's or the 6 R's. When we're doing research, then with Indigenous peoples, within food systems, we want it to be respectful, relevant, reciprocal in terms of the benefit it's bringing, and responsible. And here we have principles from our Code of Research Ethics. And if you want to look up the Code of Research Ethics, you can download a PDF copy on our website. I think I have a link later on. But really, in this approach, the self-determination of the people of Kahnawake to make decisions about research is recognized and respected. But we also work in collaboration and respect academic researchers' obligation to contribute to knowledge creation in their discipline, because together we're bringing our strengths, and we have to recognize each other's obligations as well. But overall, we agree that research needs to support the empowerment of Kahnawake to promote healthy lifestyles, to promote wellness, self-esteem, and our responsibility, the Kanien'kehá:ka responsibility of caring for 7 generations. And I also just, at this point, I want to mention another example of research that's done respectfully in this way is the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment, or CIAT. The research done through the unit is meant to support the nutrition and health of Indigenous peoples, and was started with with support of an Indigenous board back in 1994, on the same time KSCPP started. And our mission is to respond to communities, to work with them on issues that they feel important for their food systems. And out of CIAT, one of the projects that was led with Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein and Bill Erasmus and others was this Indigenous Peoples Food Systems volume with 12 case studies that show the many dimensions of culture, diversity, environment for nutrition and health. And, part of that project developed a methodology to document traditional food systems. And that methodology is also available at CIAT's website. And you can find the volume for Indigenous Peoples Food Systems on the FAO website. And with that, I just want to say thank you. And I'm showing off my sister who caught this beautiful, she was on the fishing trip that caught the beautiful sturgeon yesterday. And the sturgeon got released back into the river so it can continue to be part of that system, because we didn't need it that day. We had caught some walleye, which I cooked for dinner last night. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and thank you very much.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Trina. You're getting a lot of appreciation from the audience, which well deserved. So what an amazing series of 3 fantastic speakers like Trina. I just want to really appreciate everybody for their time. both the speakers as well as the audience for listening to this series. So there's a few more questions in the chat. I'm not sure, I'm going to read your question, Francisco Rosado May. If you're still on the webinar with us, maybe you can also provide your perspective. So Francisco was saying for the Yucatec Maya, the concept of food sovereignty isn't really, like, they don't really understand. It's not, doesn't really ring a bell. And it's similar to what you were saying, Trina, that, you know, I think as academics and researchers, certainly myself, having worked at the United Nations for a long time, we come up with these terms that don't resonate with people. So food sovereignty or food sufficiency or food security aren't really concepts that are place-based with the Yucatec Maya. And what actually they think of is the combination of all three, and that would describe their food system. So I see that, Francisco. I hope I can unmute you. Can you unmute yourself, Francisco? Or I think I still have support from my team. Can somebody... I'm trying to unmute you, Francisco. I'll continue to read your comment and hopefully somebody can help me unmute you. That it's a combination of sort of these three concepts. And then he goes on to say, how good is food sovereignty if there's a natural tragedy within the community? Why is food security important if you actually don't know how and who produced the food? And why is food sufficiency important if I depend on other non-Indigenous ways of farming? So I thought those were very interesting points. I'm not sure if there was a question in them, but it's more just food for thought, I think. And I'm terribly sorry that my skill set doesn't allow me to unmute you. And I don't know if anybody from the IT department can help with that, or Cecilia, if you're still on the line, I'm more familiar with Zoom.
Well, I can share my opinion on it if you want, and then I'll also, I think others probably have an opinion as well. So I agree. Like when we mention these terms to community, we often have to explain them because, you know, they're concepts that have been developed in a modern context to sort of help us have a common language, talk about these things over, you know, whether it be a global world or whatever the communication we need. But I think where I see the what is important is the local understanding and construction of the knowledge, the, you know, valuing of the relationship of the people to the land and the food systems. And, you know, I think in the crisis that my community had gone to, it feeds a reflection of how we need to, you know, step up in a sense, and we have to, you know, practice the responsibility that we were given to take care of our food systems. It's really challenging in a modern context because we're pulled in so many directions, and our knowledge holders, you know, work in different spaces. So it's a real challenge. I went at this thinking about sustainable self-determination, which was a concept, academic concept, by Jeff Horntassel, but really what it's about is practicing now. Like, don't wait for somebody to give you a right to do it. You know, we know what our responsibilities are. So all of these projects that were presented today, to me, demonstrate how we're trying to do that, like supporting local, the community or Indigenous food systems to, you know, decolonize them in the ways that we can to promote well-being and those responsibilities. So how those concepts are helpful, I guess, for communicating over broad audiences, but locally we have to define them, and we have them. We have those knowledge systems. It's just to make them, you know, bring them out and support them.
You know, I'd have to add to Trina's take on that, and you know, the fact of the matter is that, you know, we are our tribes are our communities. We're not tribal governments, you know, and I think, you know, with things like what NSF, the National Science Foundation, is doing now, that says that they're only going to fund research that has tribal government approval. In some ways, they're saying that we're only going to fund research that has colonial approval. And so because these tribal governments were created from colonial ways of knowing in my way. And I think, how can we do that? Have anybody ever tried to work through a tribal government to get something? And it was during the COVID crisis, as I think Valarie testified that, and has testified that, it was the people that were doing these things. It wasn't the tribal governments. And so, we need to figure out ways to get the people more involved and use the tribal governments as a way to pass through, their self-determination. Everything's important here in the United States, and it's a little bit varies up there in Canada and things like that. But, I just feel like, the community, getting these community things going, like here at Hopi, we've developed a food hub now, one of the local organizations, the food hub now. That's not only going to be help when I grow out, but to how to process those things, because it's one thing to grow something out, but it's another thing to have the people know how to process the thing right, and at Hopi, we make 42 different dishes out of corn. I know how to make 2. The women know how to make everything else. I just get out their way. And so it's very important that we look at this. But when it comes to research, I think we need to really look at, what the parameters are and who's making those parameters. Because I think if the research does not serve the community, then what good is it, in my opinion? That's just my opinion on that. But I'll just leave it at that. So if anybody wants to chime in, like Valarie, I think she wants to say something. I can see in her eyes.
And Francisco, I think we successfully unmuted you, I hope. Would you like to add?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I do not have the symbol of the microphone or the camera on my screen. Oh, thank you very much. I see my name on it. Thank you. Yeah, we've been working on indigenous food systems. I am Yucatec Maya myself, and I'm also an ecologist agroecologist by training. We know that the government uses concepts to guide some of the policies. And we've seen the use of food sufficiency, food security, and food sovereignty. And sometimes they all are used without actually clarifying what is it that they mean by each of them. But none of these 3 concepts are from indigenous thinking. They all are from non-indigenous thinking. But what we detected in our research is a saying, is an expression from the farmers who more or less this is how it goes. When I plan for my farming next year, I want to make sure food security, that I can produce enough food sufficiency without harming nature and without having to depend from the government or other communities. In other words, but at the same time, they build linkages within the community and with other communities. So it's a combination of the 3 non-indigenous concepts. It's food security, food sufficiency, and food sovereignty, but leaving enough room so that when we're right now in this peninsula, in Yucatan Peninsula, we are about to be hit by a big hurricane. And what happens, we have lived through it before, everything is destroyed. So if I design my food systems only on the food sovereignty without having linkages with other communities or other parts of the country, I'm gone. I will not have food anymore. So I cannot rest only on food sovereignty, my thinking of food production. And the same thing goes for the others. I can have food security, yes, but and the government provides, and the government makes sure that we have enough corn, we have enough maize, blah, blah. But who knows where it comes from? Most likely will be a genetically modified corn from maybe from another country. So it doesn't fit my thinking of food systems. The point is that we have to be open and understand the thinking behind the design and management of food systems in indigenous communities to be able to actually design methods for research and methods for intervention, co-creation, what we call intercultural co-creation of knowledge to improve broken indigenous food systems. That's all for now. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. And I really did appreciate how a lot of these concepts of food security, food sovereignty are, don't come from Indigenous people's ways of thinking. So I think that's a very good point. I guess just to close, I'd like to give one final word to each of the speakers. And maybe you can just give us like, what is your core take-home message or core learning from your research? Yeah, I see Trina, you have your hand up. I wanted to also say that the third webinar of the series is going to be on the 30th of July. And this is going to be on evidence-based approaches to help us meet the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly featuring Goal 0, which is zero hunger as the exemplar. So, but Trina, I will hand it over to you. And then if you'd like, you can just, I see we're also just now at time. You can hand it over to others. And also just to say, we'll post this webinar on the YouTube channel as well and have that posted on Ag2Nut. So Trina, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, and I'm going to hand it over to Valarie because I think we wanted to hear her her perspective on the big question that was just discussed, if that's okay.
Oh, sure. Well, I would just say, I agree with the comments. And I think, each community defines that concept the way that they define it. It means something different, in their language and in their way of thinking. And so I think what I do know across all the communities is something Trina said, and this would be my closing thoughts, is that you can't do this work of food sovereignty alone. You have to do it in community, and you have to have those relationships. And that's really what the heart of all of this work is, I think, is the relationships. So thank you. Yakuke.
I think that's a good way to end the discussion, given that we're at a little bit over time. I'll pass.
Yeah, I'll pass too. I mean, I just wanted just one thing I wanted to say is just, I think, Valerie's right. It really is a community that does that. And that's I'll just leave it at that. It's really the community that does these things.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Well, thank you so much to the three fantastic speakers. I know I learned a lot. It was very enriching, and thanks to all the participants. And we hope to see you on the third webinar on the 30th of July. So thank you very much to everybody.